if you try and think of scenarios where people are incredibly toxic, you might imagine something like a road rage incident, maybe a bad interaction with the next lover, or even an athlete angrily taunting fans. And all of those examples are great, however, none of them compare to the toxicity in video games. No matter which genre you play, it's almost guaranteed to have bad actors. But why are video games toxic? And what prompts people to harass and abuse other gamers? To answer these questions, I again decided to play over 30 of some of the most popular games to find out which is the most toxic. But first, I needed to lay out some ground rules. Since each game has an inconsistent number of players per match, I analyzed toxicity based off my personal encounters, making sure that I interact with at least 120 total players for every game. The next thing I had to do was define what exactly video game toxicity is, because for a lot of people, there's this fine line that separates trash talk from harassment. Certain games also have unwritten rules that are considered bad-mannered to break. Thankfully, Microsoft, the pioneers of video game voice chat themselves, has crafted a decent definition on the topic.
Do you honestly think you're fucking funny fucking with my friends? Seriously. You're a fucking ugly little cunt, mate.
What?
If I ever
No,
see you, I'm
what are
gonna
you
fucking
saying right
slit your
now? They labeled toxicity in video games as any behavior negatively impacting a person's experience. This includes categories such as communications abuse, AFKing, or griefing in a multiplayer match. Comms abuse was by far the most common, and my goodness was it obnoxious to experience. I endured plenty of slurs, callouts, and overall rages across the board, and sometimes they didn't even make sense.
The moon haunts you.
No, you guys suck. You guys fucking suck.
2, 2, 3.
What might sound like a pretty tame comment was actually kinda crazy, considering the entire lobby was fighting internet connection more than the other team. But while searching for the most verbally abusive communities, it should come to nobody's surprise that Call of Duty had the highest amount. Black Ops 6 easily took over the top spot, accumulating 14 total chat abusers throughout 11 games. And aside from their normal use of slurs, most matches sounded something like this.
Y'all like it in your butts, don't you?
Why you sound like
Y'all like it in your butts.
Although this continuous back and forth screaming was annoying, I never really felt like it got under anyone's skin. However, I can't say the same about the more competitive genres that I played. Hero shooters in particular featured an increase in player complaints. People were always pointing their fingers, looking for someone else to blame. Facing these moments severely drained my mental state, causing the fun factor to slowly drift away from me. And after conducting a poll, it turns out that other gamers also feel this way. They shared how toxic comments completely ruin their multiplayer experience, leading them to abandon the community entirely. And I think it's no secret that comms abuse is a problem, but addressing it isn't that simple either. A general suggestion is to simply... That's weird, I was trying to say remove VoIP entirely. At least, that's the absurd solution studios like Bungie are trying for their next games. Having a mute button is complicated too, because communication can vastly improve your chances of winning, so either way, sacrifices have to be made. But still, along with all of its issues, comms abuse is probably the easiest behavior to deal with. The main difficulty is that toxic chatters often overlap into other categories. A lot of bad-mannered players would get so enraged that they'd leave mid-game, causing everyone else to endure an already miserable match shorthanded. The quitting early seems specifically popular among MOBAs, and that kinda makes sense, because the matches can range from around 30 minutes to an entire hour, meaning that one small mistake can leave you feeling imprisoned against your will. It also doesn't help that leaving almost incentivizes struggling players, since they face minor punishments for abandoning a match. And pretty early on, I became aware that rage quitting was very much a reality. Dota 2 is a prime example. Most of my time in the game was spent playing unranked due to having fewer than 100 hours played, and there I saw an average of one person a game prematurely quitting. Now, a common method developers use to combat this system is by handing out timed bans that can last from a few hours to an entire permaban. The problem is that as long as a player remains clean for some time afterwards, they'll see no long-term consequences. The last toxic behavior that I encountered was griefing. This situation occurs when a player tries to make everyone in the lobby have a bad time. Depending on which game you're playing, there can be multiple indications of this activity. A player could utilize cheats in a harmful way, intentionally intentionally die to make the other team stronger, or shoot their own teammates, resulting in a disadvantage for their group. During the experiment, it was clear that no game was exempt from this type of behavior. But the absolute worst of the bunch was Rust, with GTA 5 following close behind. Griefing in both games was so terrible that they more than doubled the next closest competition in overall toxicity. Altogether, 48% of my total interactions were in bad faith. One of the most memorable moments was in GTA when I stumbled across a public car meet hosted by players throughout the server. Since I was interested, I picked up my nicest vehicle and drove over to the designated location, only for it to abruptly get massacred by someone playing God in a fighter jet. And Rust was no different. Whenever I tried to hang out with someone, they immediately gunned me down. As a result, I quickly found out that trust just doesn't exist in these games. Eventually, I did manage to make a friend who wanted to gather resources with me, but then shortly after, they shot and robbed me blind of my inventory, and I never saw him again. Experiencing both of those events was without a doubt aggravating for me, but I hesitate to truly call them toxic. Rust's official game description mentions how everyone, even the survivors, wants to kill you, so they're really only operating how the game is supposed to work. Plus, are you really playing a game like GTA to act like a model citizen? I mean, the title is a literal crime, and I'm not saying that toxicity doesn't exist in these games. There was still plenty of genuine harassment. It was just hard for me to determine what bad conduct really was. So I don't know whether to call those moments toxic or just part of the game's mechanics. But either way, this behavior definitely irritated me the most. Getting griefed in any game essentially defeats the purpose of why I'm playing in the first place, to have fun. And for that reason, playing competitive genres becomes frustrating, and the survival sandbox games turn into try-hard survival of the fittest environments, which isn't necessarily bad, it just increases the odds of a toxic community. Now, to quote the great philosopher Socrates, why do video games experience toxic behavior? Well, the most obvious answer is anonymity. Let's say we have this teammate who's been spouting slurs all game. You can report and mute them, but for all you know, Moon Knight was the one that said those words, not whoever was behind the mask. And because of that lack of information, video games and the real world are virtually two separate universes. Misbehaving in a game will have nearly zero effect outside of it because nobody knows you. The next prominent source for people's bad behavior was their ego or lack of accountability. From the very beginning, it was evident that players' first thoughts were to quickly accuse others of being at fault. Something I can compare this to is the experience of road rage. Some people believe they're flawless drivers and act like kings of the highway. When these people travel the road, they experience a sort of domino effect, where inconveniences such as heavy traffic or getting cut off can slowly amplify their distress. Eventually, they reach their breaking point and start lashing out at others. In gaming, a player who constantly dies or misses their attacks will often complain about having no support from their teammates, ultimately failing to take responsibility for their lack of contribution.
No one's holding heaven. You're sitting all the way back there right now and you're not doing anything.
How's Saxon? Pipe down.
For me though, the most intriguing reason for toxicity is sadism, or finding pleasure in others' misfortune. To help me better explain this point, I found a really great study by Uppsala University on sadism while gaming. This experiment primarily focused on the perspectives of those witnessing toxic behavior. However, I still think it applies to this conversation. It showed that most participating gamers actually found satisfaction in repeatedly killing a toxic enemy during League of Legends matches. And I think we can take that same idea and put it on to disruptive players as well. When these people are losing, they start to drag others down with them, going great lengths to make sure everyone feels miserable, therefore finding happiness when others are having a worse time. A good example of this is how players handle text chat. Even though most games censor swearing and hateful language, players still manage to find workarounds and last-ditch efforts to provoke others. For them, the act of trolling works as a form of entertainment. It's the same kind of reason as to why rage bait is so prevalent today. Nobody's forcing them to act up, they're just doing it because they want to get a reaction. And a part of me gets it, because losing sucks for everyone. But rather than toughing it out to the very end, like everyone else, these players resort to unsportsmanlike actions. Now, for anyone that's interested, here are the final tallies, along with every other game that I played throughout the experiment. I found toxicity in video games to be such a broad topic that I really only scratched the surface of. And the end goal for this project wasn't to paint gaming communities as this toxic cesspool of hate, because they aren't. As I was playing through every game, I saw that the ratio of poor sports was actually far lower than that of the friendly and fun fun individuals. I was more so curious to observe which genres run into this issue the most, along with figuring out some explanation as to why people act out when a game doesn't go their way. Ultimately, I feel like I learned a lot about video game harassment. Previously, I believed that negative encounters happen on a much more regular basis, which is why it fascinated me to discover how rare they actually were, while still being the most memorable part of a game. And after playing so many games, and some very poorly, I can safely say that gamers and their communities can be frustrating to deal with. But what's most important to remember is to not let that ruin your overall perception of a game. Anyways, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.